Hi, and welcome to this section of the pre-algebra tutor. And here we're going to begin to cover some very important topics in this section and the next few sections. This section is on the topic of adding integers. And if you remember from a couple sections ago, an integer is a positive number, negative number, or zero. No decimal point involved, it's just the whole numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and on positive and on negative. So we have the negative numbers and the positive numbers to deal with, and we're going to learn how to add them in this section. So we've broken up the sections here. This one is on adding integers, and then we'll have one on subtracting integers, and then multiplying integers, and then dividing integers. And I'm going to tell you right now, this is not hard. It's nothing more difficult than your third grade math that you learned before. It's just there's a couple of more rules to learn because we have negative numbers involved. And I'm going to tell you something. I want you to watch this section and practice enough problems to where you really feel like you really and truly understand and can do these kinds of things, because a lot of people, if they don't understand how to add numbers properly, negative and positive numbers properly, or subtract them, multiply them, divide them, then of course when you get to equations and other things later on, it's just going to seem hard, and it doesn't have to be that way. So we've got a ton of example problems, a ton of different ways to memorize and learn the little rules involved, and we're going to learn it by doing. So let's do that now. Now, before we actually get to the addition, I need to cover one very important topic, very easy topic with you, and that is the concept of the absolute value of a number. The absolute value of a number has a big word, not a hard thing at all. So let's talk about that briefly. Well, a lot of you probably already know what this is, but for those of you that don't, the absolute value of a number is a very simple concept if it's explained in the right way. So let me give you a few numerical examples just instead of telling you in words what it is. The absolute value of the number 3, and these bars here, don't be scared off by them. That's just a math symbol, that tells you that we're talking about the absolute value of this number. So there's lots of symbols in math, equals, plus, negative, square root, all these things. There was a time when you didn't know any of them, so don't be upset if you don't know the symbol. Just absorb it and say, okay, this is what we're going to call the absolute value. The absolute value of a number 3, which is an everyday number you've dealt with all your life, is just the number 3. Okay, I'm going to give you a few examples, and then we're going to go and kind of wrap it up with a general observation. The absolute value of the number 5 that you've learned all your life is just the number 5. The absolute value of the number 1 that you've dealt with all your life is just the number 1. So you see, it's not a hard concept, just like I was telling you. And I'm going to get into some words and what absolute value is in a second. But let me show you a little something interesting. The absolute value of the number -2, which is negative numbers are new to a lot of people in this course. The absolute value of this is not -2, it's +2. The absolute value of -7 is equal to 7. And the absolute value of, let's say, -10 is equal to 10. So you can see whatever number you put in the inside of these little brackets here, whether it's positive or whether it's negative, no matter what you put in there, the absolute value is going to take the sign away. It's going to strip the sign off. If it's positive, it's going to stay positive. If it's a negative in there, you strip that negative away, and the answer is positive. So that is the absolute value. Now, why would we take the time to define something like this? Why would we care about that? Well, if you look at a number line, which we did a lot in the last section, so this is 0, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This is -1, -2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Let me take a minute to label it. -3, -4, -5, -6, -7, -8, -9, -10, and then over here we can just do it down below. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so why do we care about this stuff? Let me choose a different color here. We said the absolute value of the number 3, which is here on the number line, is equal to 3. What absolute value really is it's basically telling you what is the distance between that number that you have in the brackets and 0. That's why we call it the absolute value, because the real value of the number is just -5 or -2 or +3 or whatever the number is. That's the value of the number. But the absolute value is basically saying, okay, I'm not going to look at the sign of the number. let me actually put this as a 0 in a different color so we can make it easier. I'm not going to look at the sign of a number. I just want to know absolutely how far away it is from 0. So this is 3 units away from 0. That's why the absolute value is 3. Number 5 is 5 units away from 0. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the absolute value is 5. The number 1 is 1 unit away from 0, so the absolute value is 1. Now, negative 2 is over here. Yes, it is a negative number, and yes, it's on this side of 0, but absolute value is basically trying to get you to look and see, well, what is the actual distance, the total distance from here to 0? No matter if it's positive or negative, how far away is it? So this is 2 units away. That's why we have a positive number here. Negative 7 is over here. And yeah, it's a negative number too, but it is 7 units away. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 units away from 0. So that's why we call it the absolute value is 7. And of course, negative 10 is over here, and it's 10 units away, so the absolute value is 10. The reason that this is important when we start to add numbers together is because we're going to be adding negative numbers in with the positive numbers. And so you have to know that the negative numbers, yes, they do lie over here, and yes, that's extremely important, but you'll see as we go on through it that knowing what the absolute value is, being able to strip the sign away and just look at the number and then go back and figure out what to do with that sign in the end of it, that is going to be very useful the way I'm going to teach you how to add these integers together. So the basic idea is the absolute value teaches you or tells you the distance between whatever point it is you have and 0. That's why we call it the absolute value, because it's the value of the number absolutely independent of the sign. Strip the sign away, this is how far away it is from 0. That's what absolute value is. So on your test, if you have absolute value with some stuff in here, all you're going to do to give the answer is take the sign, throw it away. What you have left over is absolute value. See, it's a very simple concept. Now, we're going to get into the fun topic of adding integers together. Some of it's going to seem trivial. Some of it is going to seem like, wow, that's not so hard. And I hope it's the latter. And so let's go ahead and do that now. There are a few rules. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the rules, give some examples as we do it, and then we're going to hit a ton of problems. So if you don't think you quite get it as we hit the rule the first time, that's okay. Just keep going and watch all the examples. It will come to you by repetition. You'll see the patterns involved. So don't give up if you don't quite get it on the first one. The rules that we're going to have, okay, are basically going to look like this. Some of them, like I said, are going to be trivial. So here are the rules. The first rule is if we're adding a positive number, so I'm going to use the word the POS, positive, to a positive number. So in other words, positive to positive, right? What is going to happen in that case? The result, these little arrows I'm going to tell you, this is the result. So the result of this addition is positive. All right, now this should come as no surprise to you. I'm writing it down in words, so you might be a little bit taken aback, but what this is just saying is that, yeah, you have positive and negative numbers, all right, that we're going to be dealing with, but we're going to take it one case at a time. Let's look at the case, the easy case, positive plus positive. You know from your childhood that 2 plus 2 is 4, 2 plus 3 is 5, etc., etc. Positive plus positive is always positive. If I have 3 pencils and I add 3 more pencils, then I'm going to get 6 pencils. It's always positive. Positive plus positive gives me a positive number. So congratulations, you already learned how to add some integers together. So some examples. Again, I know it's trivial, but just to make it clear, 3 plus 4 is 7. This is a positive plus a positive. You're always going to get a positive. 5 plus 5 is 10. Always going to get a positive. 2 plus 3 is equal to 5. Always going to get a positive. So this would be like 3 cars plus 4 more cars. Going to give me 7 cars altogether. So I wanted to start with the most, the easiest of the cases because, you'll have to use it just like any of the other cases, and you'll get some confidence from knowing that you already know how to do this stuff. Positive plus positive always gives you positive, no big deal. Now the next case, again, is really a little bit different from maybe anything you've had to do before, but it's definitely not hard. If you're adding a negative number to a negative number, this is the next easiest case. In other words, a negative to a negative number, then the result the result is always negative. Negative, right? So it's always going to be negative. So negative plus negative is always going to give you a negative. Now, before we do any problems or examples or anything, I want you to think about what this means, right? I told you a negative number in the previous sections. A negative number is nothing more than basically explaining when you don't have something, but in fact you owe something to somebody else. So if I have negative 5 apples, then I don't actually have any apples at all. I actually owe somebody else. I've borrowed 5 apples. So I didn't have anything to begin with, but somehow I owe somebody else 5 apples. So the way I represent that is negative 5 apples, or negative 5. Now let me ask you, if I already owe somebody 5 apples, so I have negative 5 apples, but then I go down the street and I borrow 5 more apples from somebody else, so I actually owe somebody else 5 more apples, so that's another negative 5 apples. Then I have the negative 5 apples that I had to begin with because I owed somebody else 5 apples. And then I owe a different person 5 more apples because I borrowed some more. Then how many do I owe altogether? How many do I owe altogether? I owe 5 apples to this guy and I owe 5 apples to this guy. So altogether I actually owe 10 apples. So that's negative 10, because in our whole algebra world, negative means a deficit, something that you owe somebody else. It's on the other side of the number line, on the other side of 0. So if I owe 3 Band-Aids to somebody and then I go borrow 5 more, then the negative 3 plus the negative 5, I'm going to owe 8 Band-Aids altogether. So that's negative 8. So that's what I'm saying. When you add a negative number to a negative number, the answer is always negative. Because if you start out owing somebody something and then you borrow more stuff, you're always going to owe something in the end. And you're going to owe the addition of those two things because you borrowed more stuff, right? So let's do some quick examples to show how this might work. So if you had negative 3 plus negative 3, that would be negative 6. So if I borrowed 3 Band-Aids and I borrowed 3 additional Band-Aids, then in the end of the day I'm going to owe all these people 6 Band-Aids total. So you see what you're doing here is when you're adding negative numbers together, you end up adding the absolute values together, 3 plus 3. That's why we had to learn absolute value. You add the 3 plus 3 to get 6, but the sign that you put out front is going to always be negative in this case because negative plus negative is negative. That's what I'm trying to teach you by patterns here. So another example, if I had negative 2 plus negative 3, I'm going to add the absolute values together, so I'm going to have 5, but it's negative plus negative, so I'm going to actually put a negative 5 there. So if I already owed somebody 2 cotton balls, and I borrowed 3 more cotton balls, then at the end of the day, I owe all these people 5 cotton balls altogether. So negative 4 plus negative 5 is equal to, adding the absolute values together, 4 plus 5 gives me 9, but I can't put positive 9. It's got to be negative 9 because I already owed somebody 4 tires, and then I borrowed 5 more tires, so I owe 9 tires altogether. That's what the negative sign means. And so one more, negative 2 plus negative 11. If I want to add them, I'm going to add the absolute values. 2 plus 11 is 13, but the answer is not positive 13. That wouldn't even make any sense. If I owe somebody something and then I borrow more stuff, I'm not going to have positive. I'm going to have a negative number because I'm going to owe 13 units of whatever, 13 candy bars. If I borrowed 2 to begin with and then I borrow 11 more later in the day, I'm going to owe 13 candy bars altogether. So you see, you've already learned something that a lot of people struggle with for a long time in pre-algebra, adding these negative numbers together. But if you know what it means, it is definitely not hard. Now, you definitely need to remember this. Negative plus negative is negative. But hopefully with a few of these examples, I've solidified it a little bit more for you. Now, I want to show you one more thing with the number line. Definitely do it exactly the way in which I showed you. But let's take this one right here, for instance. Let's draw a little segment of a number line here. Let's say this is 0. The number line goes off that way too, but let's say it's 0. And then I have negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4, negative 5. Negative 4, negative 3, negative 2, negative 1. Now we start out at negative 2, so we put our little initial dot sort of right here. So we're going to start here. Right? We start out here, and we're going to add to it negative 3. Right? Now, in the number line problems we did before, usually when you add numbers, together, you go this way on the number line because you're adding and you're getting bigger. However, you're not adding a positive number here, you're actually adding a negative number, which is adding a deficit, or adding, basically you're borrowing more stuff. So anytime you add a negative number, you're going to be going this direction. It just makes sense. You need to think about what you're doing. So you're going to add 3 more. 1, 2, 3. And that's why you end up at negative 5, and that's why the answer is negative 5. I'm just trying to give you a little graphical help on why this might be the case. So the next one, 0, negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4, negative 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So negative 4 is negative 1, 2, 3, 4, and negative 9 is here. So then if you're going to represent this addition right here graphically, you're going to start at negative 4. This is your start point. That's why I put start. And you're going to add negative 5 more, but you're not adding a positive number, you're adding more borrowing. So in fact, you're going to go this direction. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You added negative 5 more, and that gets you at a grand total of negative 9. So all of the number line stuff that we did is super important because it kind of explains to you graphically what you're doing with this addition and subtraction. And you could whip out a number line for every time you wanted to add numbers together. You could totally do that. However, as you can see, it would get very cumbersome to just write number lines all the time. So don't do that. I'm just trying to give you kind of a foundation of what we're doing here. Don't draw a number line every time. Just think about the rules I'm telling you. Positive plus positive always gives you positive. This is what you learned in first grade. Negative plus negative is always going to give you negative, and to find the number, you just simply add the absolute values together of the numbers. In other words, you add the numbers themselves together and you slap a negative on front. So we've covered positive plus positive. We've covered negative plus negative. The only other combination is if you have a positive plus a negative, or a negative plus positive. And that's actually going to be the same bucket, so to speak. Okay, now for the third case, it's not very difficult, but we're going to go ahead and make a lot of examples out of it so that you understand. If you're adding either a positive to a negative, which you could kind of write it as plus to negative, positive to negative, or negative to positive. The good news is you're going to do exactly the same thing in both cases. So positive to negative or negative plus positive, you're going to do exactly the same thing in both of those cases, but it's something, again, you haven't learned before because you're just learning about these negative numbers. So what you're going to do in this case, the result can be positive or negative. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky to people. So it could be a positive number or it could be a negative number in the answer. And the trick is, how do you figure out if it's positive or negative? The sign, let me put it a different way. The answer that you get will be the same sign as the larger absolute value in your problem. Okay, now I know you're reading this and you're like, oh my goodness, I definitely don't get this. But you know what? It's just like anything else in math. You crack open a book, you read a definition, and your brain shuts down because maybe you don't understand what they're saying. Let's read it together one more time. When you're adding a positive to a negative or a negative to a positive, all I'm telling you is that the answer can be either positive or negative, right? Either one. And the way you find out if it's going to be positive or negative is that the answer is going to have the same exact sign as whichever number has the larger absolute value in the original problem, right? So it's a lot of words, but I think you'll get it really quickly if we just go ahead and draw some pictures and do some problems. So let's say we had 5, positive 5, plus negative 2. So you see we have a positive plus a negative right there. Now the answer is going to be 3, positive 3. So let me go ahead and explain first of all that the answer in the sign of the answer, right here, has exactly the same sign as the number with the larger absolute value. See, this is positive 5 and this is negative 2. remember absolute value, it just gets rid of the sign. So this number is actually bigger from an absolute value point of view than the negative number. So the answer is going to be positive just because this number is positive. And of course this is negative here. Now what do you do to get the actual number? You just simply subtract the absolute values here. So 5 minus 2 is 3, so that's why we get a 3 there. Let's do another one, and I think you'll see it by repetition. What if you had 4 plus negative 3? 4 plus negative 3. Well, what you're going to do here, because they're different signs like this, you're going to basically take and subtract the numbers from one another, just a simple absolute value. So 4 minus 3 is going to give you 1. And the larger of these two numbers, absolute value-wise, is positive. So this is going to be positive 1. Now, we know that, I'm drawing this little arrow to show you that it comes from there. We know that when you write positive numbers down, you don't need to carry this plus sign all over the place. I'm just doing it on the board to show you explicitly what's going on. Do a couple of additional. 6 plus negative 4. All right? So what you do when you have it with different signs, no matter if it's negative plus positive or positive plus negative, is you just simply subtract the numbers. 6 minus 4 gives me 2. And the bigger number is positive, so there's a positive sign there. When I say the bigger number, it's the absolute value, right? Now let's flip it around a little bit. And let's say I had negative 2, so a negative number first, plus positive 3. But it's exactly the same thing. You just take the numbers that you have a 2 here and you have a 3 here, and you subtract them. 3 minus 2 gives you 1. And the bigger number is this one on the absolute value side of things, so it's positive. So the sign kind of came from the fact that that one was bigger. Now if you had something like this, negative 9 plus positive 5, you're going to do the same thing. It's negative plus positive, so you have different signs, so you subtract. So you subtract 9 minus 5 is going to give you 4. But see, the bigger number here, absolute value-wise, is actually negative because the absolute value of negative 9 is 9, and the absolute value of that is just 5. So what you're going to have here is negative 4. That's going to be the answer here. And of course, if the answer is negative, you have to keep the negative sign around. Let's do one more, and then we'll draw a couple of pictures. Let's say we had negative 10 plus 2. So we have a negative plus positive, so we subtract the numbers. 10 minus 2 is 8. And the larger of these two numbers is the 10 absolute value-wise, so the answer is going to be negative. So you see, it's consistent. It's the same thing. When you have positive plus negative, or negative plus positive, in every case, all you do is subtract the numbers from one another. It doesn't matter which one's first or which one's second. You just take the bigger number and subtract the other one. That's going to be your answer. And then, in fact, if it's positive or negative, just comes from whichever one is larger. Now, let me clue you in on a little bit of something here and tell you that I didn't explicitly tell you this, but when you have a positive plus a negative or a negative plus a positive, it's basically the same thing as subtracting the numbers. So what we're writing here is a plus negative 2 is really the same thing as subtracting 2, because you already know that 5 minus 2 gives you 3. So it just gets a little bit confusing when you have the negative in the front. You may not know how to read it, but I'm trying to give you this bulletproof way to do it. You subtract the numbers and stick the positive or negative on accordingly. Now, if you had represented this like in a number line, just to kind of do a couple of quick ones here, okay, then you would have a number line here, like let's say for this one, and this would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, negative 1, negative 2, negative 3. So negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you always start, just to make it easy and consistent, go ahead and start with the first number. You start over here, so I'm going to put here a little arrow, start. That's where I'm starting. And I'm adding to it a negative number, which means I'm not going to go to the right because I'm not adding a positive number. I'm adding a negative number, so I'm going to go to the left. And I'm going to do that 3 units. 1, 2, 3. So I landed here. The answer is positive 1. Just exactly what we got. If we had something like this, 0, negative 1, negative 2, 1, 2, 3. And if we're doing this problem, we start at negative 2. We're going to start right here, right? And in this case, we are adding a positive number, so we are going to move on the right, and we're going to go 3 times, 1, 2, 3, and we're going to land at positive 1, so that's right here. So you see the number line does give us the right answer just like it did the last time. You can always start with that first number and you can always move left or move right depending on if you're adding or subtracting your number. But again, you can't draw a number line every time you have to do this. You need to get comfortable with doing it. The bulletproof way of doing it is basically just to memorize that whenever you have a positive plus a negative, or a negative plus a positive, either way, all you do is subtract the numbers, the absolute values, to get the number, and then the sign comes from the bigger absolute value. Now let me show you one more thing, and then we're gonna work several problems. I told you that, basically I told you that adding, I'm just gonna write it down, adding a negative number, and this is the number sign, negative number, is the same thing exact thing as subtraction. So when you were in first grade, they didn't really tell you about negative numbers because it would confuse you. But it's easy to understand the concept of subtraction. All I'm trying to say is that when you write these things like this, it ends up doing the same thing as subtraction. So for instance, let's say you had 5 plus negative 1. This is exactly the same thing as 5 minus 1, which is 4. And you would get the same answer the way I told you. I said subtract the numbers, that would give you a 4, and the sign comes from the bigger absolute value, positive, right? What if you had 8 plus negative 6? This is exactly the same thing as when you have a plus minus there, it's 8 minus 6, and that's going to give you a 2. So anytime you have a plus minus in there, I guess is really what I'm trying to teach you, it's exactly the same thing as subtraction. Now, if you want to leave it written like this, or if you want to convert it over to a looking like subtraction, you can do that. That's either way you want. If you had negative 3 plus negative 4, that's exactly the same thing as negative 3 minus 4. And remember, we learned how to do that in just a second ago. Negative plus negative always gave us a negative answer, and we just added the absolute value. So we had negative 7. 3 plus 4 is 7. Negative comes because it's negative plus negative. I already had owed somebody something. I borrowed 4 more things, so of course I'm going to have it like that. So when you're working your problems, and in fact in the next section we're going to actually subtract integers. I guess what I'm really trying to tell you is you're already really subtracting integers. We're just going to formulate it a little bit more like you'll see it in the textbook here in the next section to kind of give you more practice. But this is basically the same thing as subtraction. And I do remember back when they told me that when I first learned algebra, and I just didn't get it. But you have to realize is a negative number is when you owe somebody something. Subtraction is when you owe somebody something. You take it away, right? So those two things are really the same thing. When you have plus negative, it's the same thing as basically subtracting that away. So however is better for you to think about it. If it's easier for you to convert this like this, that's fine. If it's easier for you to leave it like this and use the rules I've given you, that's fine too. Okay, now we've learned all the rules. Positive plus positive is positive. Negative plus negative, you add the numbers and you always put a negative sign in front. Positive plus negative or negative plus positive, you always subtract those numbers and then you choose the sign based on which one of those numbers is bigger absolute value-wise. So what we're going to do now is work a ton of problems. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little reminder. Positive plus positive is going to always give you a positive number. Negative plus negative is always going to give you a negative number. Positive plus negative or negative plus positive can give you positive or negative. And whatever you choose is going to depend upon the numbers that are actually given to you in your problem. So let's leave this here, and I won't erase it, and let's just work some problems. So let's say we have 2 plus negative 6. 2 plus negative 6. I've got a positive plus a negative, which is this case, and that's the case we just did. So I subtract these numbers. 6 minus 2 gives me 4, and the negative sign is what I use because this number is the bigger absolute value-wise. Next problem. Negative 2 plus negative 6. So here I have a negative plus another negative number. That's the other case where I already borrowed something and I borrowed some more stuff. So the answer is negative 8 because 6 plus 2 gives me 8. Negative plus negative always gives me negative. 3. Negative 6 plus 2. Again, here it's negative plus positive, so they're different signs. When they're different, I subtract them. 6 minus 2 is 4, and the bigger number goes, absolute value-wise, is where my sign comes from. Notice that number 1 and number 3 give me exactly the same answer. 2 plus negative 6 is exactly the same thing as negative 6 plus 2. This is no different than, 3 plus 2 gives me 5. 2 plus 3 gives me 5. If you flip the numbers, the way in which you order the numbers doesn't matter at all. For regular numbers, 1 plus 3 is 4. 3 plus 1 is 4. Flip them around, same thing. Same thing here. I've got 2 plus negative 6. Negative 6 plus 2 should give me exactly the same answer, and it does. Let's say I have negative 6 plus negative 2. So, again, same thing. Negative plus negative is always going to give me negative. 6 plus 2 is always going to give me 8. Because when they're the same sign like that, I always add them. And again, it gives me the same answer because I just flipped the order. So let's do 14 plus 6. That's just regular addition. That's 20. And let's say because positive plus positive is positive. Now let's say I have negative 14 plus 6. Negative plus positive, when they're different signs, I always subtract them. So 14 minus 6 is 8. And the sign comes from the bigger absolute value, right? So it makes sense. If I owed somebody 14 peanuts and somebody gave me 6 more, I'm still going to owe somebody some peanuts. I'm going to owe somebody 8 peanuts. Negative 14 plus negative 6. Negative plus negative is always going to give me negative. 14 plus 6 is going to be 20. So when they're the same sign, I always add the absolute values, and I take the sign because it always keeps the sign of what I was adding there. 14 plus negative 6 is positive plus negative. So I end up subtracting them. 14 minus 6 is going to give me 8, and the sign comes from the bigger absolute value. In this case, it's positive 8. Okay? Now let's say we do something a little more complicated. Negative 2 plus 3 plus negative 1. So I'm adding 3 numbers together. You can do that just like you can do that, in basic math. You work left to right just like you think you would. So negative 2 plus 3 is going to give me positive 1 because I'm going to basically subtract these numbers. 3 minus 2 is 1, and the sign comes from the bigger number. So this gives me a 1, and I still have to deal with this negative 1 here, plus negative 1. And of course, negative 1 plus positive 1 is just going to give me 0 because I subtract these two numbers. 1 minus 1 is 0. Okay. Now let's say I have negative 1 plus 6 plus 3 is equal to. You work left to right. So first, let's deal with this. Negative 1 plus 6 is going to be positive 5 because 6 minus 1 is 5. And the sign always comes from the bigger number when we're subtracting like that. We still have to have our plus 3 that's still here. So 5 plus 3 is 8. Right? So 5 plus 3 is 8. Continuing on, if you had 3 plus negative 2 plus negative 1, then you work left to right just like you always do. So you have this guy right here to deal with. Since it's different signs, you're going to end up subtracting them. 3 minus 2 is 1, and the sign comes from the bigger of these numbers, this one, so it's positive, plus negative 1, right? And that's going to give you 0. Okay, what if you had 4 plus negative 4 plus negative 2? So first things first, you want to deal with this. So 4 plus negative 4 is 0 because you have different signs here. So 4 minus 4 is going to give you the 0, and that's why it's 0. Plus the negative 2 that you have left over here. 0 plus negative 2 is going to be negative 2. Just like, 0 plus 1 is 1. So the rules are really no different. What if you add negative 1 plus negative 2 plus negative 3? Right? So then you deal with what's on the left first, like this. So negative 1 plus negative 2 is going to give you, these are negative plus negative, so you have to add them together and get 3, and negative plus negative always gives you a negative. And then you have plus negative 3 right on the other side of it. And so when you add those things together, negative plus negative, it's always going to give you negative, and you're going to get 6 because 3 plus 3 is 6. So I owed somebody 3 Twinkies. I borrowed 3 more Twinkies, so I owe altogether 6 Twinkies to somebody. Okay, now let's go 2 plus absolute value of negative 4, something like that. Absolute value is not mystical, but you do need to know how it works. So absolute value of negative 4, we said, would be positive 4. And when you add these together, you get 6. 2 plus 4 is 6. Okay? And if you had 3 plus absolute value of 2, it would be something similar. You'd have 3 plus absolute value of 2 is just simply 2. So you would get 5. 3 plus 2 is 5. We'll do one more like this. We'll say 6 plus absolute value of negative 5 is equal to 6 plus, what's the absolute value of negative 5? It's just going to be a positive 5. And 6 plus 5 is always going to be 11. I lied to you. Let's do one more with the absolute value. Negative 3 plus negative 2. So absolute value of negative 3 plus absolute value of negative 2. Absolute value of negative 3 is positive 3. Absolute value of negative 2 is just regular old 2. And so you add these two things together and you get a positive 5. So you see, you just have to think one step at a time. If you're given a, this might really have intimidated you before you started this course or started this section. You have to break it apart. Absolute value gives me this, absolute value gives me this, and now I'm simply adding them together. When I had one like this, I deal with the first two things first, given the rules that I have. And you just simply go from there. Now we're going to do one more type of problem that's really interesting that you'll see a lot. And in your books, you might see something like this. If A is equal to 2, and B is equal to negative 1, and C is equal to 5, and D is equal to negative 3, then evaluate the expression. Now remember, when you see letters, don't be upset by that. That just means that you have represented a letter with a number. So if you wanted to do something like A plus C, this might look really scary algebra thing. All you're doing is you're just substituting in what you know these values are. So 2 plus 5, which is 7. So congratulations, you've done your first substituting into an expression. This is called an expression, something that has letters and numbers like that you substitute into. So let's say you had B plus C. So B is negative 1 plus C is 5. And so negative 1 plus 5, from the rules we learned, they're different signs, so we subtract the numbers. 5 minus 1 is 4, and the larger number gives me my sign. So the answer is positive 4. Now if we had A plus B plus C, again, it's starting to look really complicated, but it's not, because you just substitute in 2 plus negative 1 plus C, which is 5. And then you deal with it exactly the way that you dealt with it a minute ago. You start left to right, so you deal with these. 2 plus negative 1, these are different signs, so I subtract them. 2 minus 1 is 1. The sign comes from the bigger number, so it stays positive. I still have to add this 5 on there. 1 plus 5 is 6, and that is the answer to that. And then if you had something like A plus B plus C plus D, you guessed it, it's nothing different. 2 plus negative 1 plus 5 plus negative 3. Literally all you do is you put in the numbers for each of these letters, and then you deal with it. So we already figured out a minute ago that negative 2 plus 1 is negative 2 plus 1 is positive 1, and here's a different way to do it. You can then add these numbers together if you want. So 5 plus negative 3, they're different signs, so you subtract them. 5 minus 3 gives me 2, and the sign comes from the bigger number, so it stays positive. And these two things are added together, so I just add them together. 1 plus 2 is 3, so the answer is 3. You can do it left to right, just like I said before. We could have added this, and we could have added this one, and we could have added this one. I'm just showing you a different way. You can break the problem up into two little pieces, and then add those pieces together. That's perfectly fine. One final problem. If you had A plus absolute value of C, then it would be the same thing. A is 2 plus absolute value of C is 5. right? And so then you would convert that over to what you know. The absolute value of 5 is just simply 5, so 2 plus 5 is 7. And if you had a different letter in here, you would just take the absolute value of that and then you would add it together. So the answer is 7. So that concludes the section on adding integers. It's a very, very important section. Make sure you watch it enough times. Make sure you watch it enough times to really get comfortable with it and to really feel like you can do these kinds of problems. It will make your life so much easier as you move on down the line to have this really solidified under your belt. And I'll give you another hint. The next section that we're going to do on subtracting integers is not going to seem as hard because we've already been subtracting some stuff here. When you start having negative and positive numbers and adding them together, you're always going to be doing some subtraction at some point along the way. So we kind of had to introduce that here. We'll get some more practice in the next section as well. My name is Jason. Watch this section a few times if you need to. Make sure you understand it. I guarantee you that it'll help you in your study of pre-algebra and serve you well on into Algebra 1 and every other math class beyond that.